And good afternoon from a beautiful, if somewhat crisp, Pittsburgh, where everything out in the vista from my back deck is now brown and gold and turning red. Fall is upon us rather beautifully, although strangely enough, and I think it's to do with the odd warm days we keep getting, I noticed a dandelion growing. It shouldn't be there until next spring. James, hello. Welcome to you from Crafton. Hello, David, from this particular village very close to Stratford-on-Avon. I will actually be mentioning Stratford-upon-Avon in this afternoon's conversation. Hello, Grace. Welcome from Dublin. And Shelley, welcome back to you. And welcome to all of those who are not live with us, but who I do know, because they tell me so, that they watch the recording on YouTube. And of course, all of you who are watching, I know, will have been signing up on our YouTube channel and subscribing and telling all your friends to subscribe as well. Because as I keep reminding you, the more people who subscribe to our YouTube channel, the better value we get out of it. So please don't just log in, subscribe as well, and it would make our life so much better. Thank you yet again to the Allegheny Foundation, who have sponsored this year's webinars. It makes such a difference to us. Even though the webinars are free to you, they're not free to us. We do have to pay for them. And so the support from the Allegheny Foundation is of enormous help to us, and we are profoundly grateful. You can donate. Remember, we have a special on donations, 25 for 25, right through the end of November of this year. We're simply asking, no matter what you would normally donate, and if you have normally donated or plan to donate your normal amount, please add $25. That's all. And if you haven't donated and you feel the urge to do so and you're not sure, whether you can or not, $25 buys you what? 5 cups of coffee? So please consider sending us the $25. You can send a check. You can go onto the website and log in. And by the way, the newly improved website will be up and running very soon. And because I know we've had some problems with it, but the whole thing has been rigorously serviced and will be, the new improved website will be available very soon. It won't look very different, but it will function much better. Subscriptions and single tickets are still now and constantly on sale. Very reasonably priced. As You Like It will be running till the 20th of November. We got a fantastic review the other day, but modesty prevents me from quoting from it. But I'm telling you, every word about it, every single word of it was quite correct. Anyway, do try and get to see As You Like It if you're in the Pittsburgh region. It's an absolutely gorgeous show, and the cast are amazing. There's Helen Faye. Hello, welcome. Haven't seen you for a couple of weeks, but I hope you'll be watching online. Pat, welcome back from Oakland. Not too far away from where I am. It's nice to see all these people tuning in of a Friday. What else would you do on a Friday afternoon or evening if you're across the pond? But tune in to Big Classic Theatre and our webinar. Now, how are we doing? Just gone 2 o'clock. We'll give the latecomers another minute and then we'll make a start. I do recognize that people have to put something else down before they can tune in to us. We have to recognize that. Not everybody is as punctual as the rest of us. But we love them anyway. And we'd like them to be with us than not. All right, I think we'll make a start. Now, before I begin today, I have to tell you a health problem. And if you can see through my glasses, you might notice it that this eye, this eye, that's the one. It's all reversed on the screen in front of me. This eye, I have to get a treatment done every 8 weeks. And I had the treatment yesterday, but it reacted rather badly for the first time. So I very nearly didn't do the webinar because my eye was streaming this morning. It's a lot better now. But looking at a computer screen does tend to make it rather sore. So if you see me fidgeting with my eye, that's the reason why. And the webinar might be a bit shorter today because of the limited time I can actually look at the screen. It's fine. I'm okay. Nothing wrong. Particularly, it's just the treatment rather affects the eye. Anyway, it's all a village. Now, let's begin with the simple statement that I often make. Everything I tell you may be wrong. This is my opinion. So when I talk about topics concerning theatre, I'm only talking about them from my perspective and how I do it and have been doing it for best part of 60 years now. So my ideas are personal. They're my opinions, and you're perfectly welcome to disagree with them. But what I always try to do with these programs, whether we're talking about the 7 basic plots, and there's the book, by the way, that I recommend behind me, whether I'm talking about that or individual plays or theatrical concepts or writers, it all comes down, I believe, to a fundamental about why theatre works, why theatre happens, and how theatre operates. So under this generic title, It's All a Village, which is basically a continuing examination of plot lines and themes in plays. You may wonder, well, what the hell has that title got to do with plot lines and themes and playwriting? Well, as with the examination of, with all examinations of plays that I've been covering, it's actually very nearly 70 webinars now, that's quite a lot. The purpose is not simply to examine the what that happens in a play, the full storyline. I seldom will tell you the story of a play or discuss it. I will make the assumption that if it intrigues you, you'll go away and read the play and find out. Rather, I prefer to discuss the why and the how. Hello, Marlene. Glad you loved As You Like It, especially the red shoes. And if you want to know about the red shoes, you have to come and see it. Anyway, what I'm discussing is not the what that happens in a play, but rather the why and the how that it happens. And by that process, hopefully we will find a recognition within the play to things that happen in our own lives or in our own society. Because that way, the vital, important R word happens, recognition. Now, I have always held to the principle that there is nothing new under the sun. Nothing is ever new except fashion and technology. And even fashion does tend to come around again. I mean, keep those dresses, keep those pants, because sooner or later they'll be in fashion again. Technology is the only thing that constantly advances. But it's not that we're finding something new, we're simply improving on ideas that we had 100 years ago. So on that principle that there is nothing new, storylines, as I discussed last week, the principle that all plays are based on the idea of overcoming the darkness. No matter what the particular plot theme may be, that idea of overcoming the darkness is fundamentally there within just about any plot line, any novel, any book, any movie that you wish to use as an example. All plots lead us away from safety into peril and then back to safety again. And that's an idea that we can all recognize. And strangely enough, it's an idea that happens in all our lives. That concept will always seem very familiar to us from plays and movies because they seem to mirror, or should seem to mirror, our own lives, not in the actual events, but in the principle behind it. For instance, from the moment that you leave the comfort and safety of your home in the morning to the moment that you return to its safety and comfort in the evening, you are on a potentially dangerous journey into the darkness. Who knows what peril will await you? On the street, in the market, in the office, even the cocktail bar. The possibilities are endless that something will happen to you that will cause a change you do not expect, put you into a risk or danger that you did not anticipate. I mean, you could go out in the morning perfectly happy and come home in the evening engaged to be married. You don't know. There is a darkness. I'm not equating engagement to be married with darkness, although I've had unfortunate experience myself. But it is a possibility. There is an endless series of possibilities of things that can happen between being in the light to returning to the light. And that happens. That's how plays work. That's how history works. For instance, something I discussed in a previous webinar. A certain Julius Caesar went out on the morning of the 15th of March to attend a rather boring meeting of the Senate. Nothing wrong in that. He ended up a few hours later quite dead, assassinated by his friends. This is an example of leaving the comfort and security of the light and going out and the darkness descending. And there was no way back from that. If you want a slightly more up-to-date rendition of that, exactly the same thing happened in literature and cinema to one Don Corleone, who had left his home that morning, worked in his office all day, on his way home stopped in the street to buy some oranges, and was riddled with bullets. At least, unlike Caesar, Don Corleone got back to the relative safety of his home eventually. But if you look at it, it is exactly that same proposition, that you leave in safety unexpecting, even if you do expect the possibility, as any Don such as Corleone would, you can't prepare for every eventuality. And the eventualities can happen. But it is fundamentally that same recognizable theme that you see between Julius Caesar and Don Corleone. Now, we always hope that such extremes will not happen to us. You know, that our friends might assassinate us in the office, or when we go shopping at the market to get the weekend groceries, somebody will riddle us with bullets. One hopes that won't happen, but you would be surprised to recognize the possibility. In fact, even though we hope it won't happen to us, we could be hit by a bus, or we could fall victim to a mass shooting, or we just could lose our wallet with all our credit cards. Things happen. Stuff happens. And stuff happens on such an almost regular pattern that we can recognize it when we see it in art. Art demonstrates the possibilities of our own life. No matter what that possibility, how extreme or how pleasant or how relatively unimportant that may be, the same pattern exists. So, there is another aspect to drama, because that's just a continuation or extension of last week's thought. There's another aspect to drama and its creation that equally mirrors our own lives. And if it were not so, we could not recognize it or understand it. Drama would not work without our capacity to understand and recognize it. In other words, that theatre doesn't work if you don't see what's going on. If you don't see it, if you don't recognize it, theatre, TV, movies, literature won't work. So, this week, I want to examine the theory that all plays are based on a close and often closed society in which the characters must flourish. But it must be a society that we can recognize. So, whether the play is a modern or a classic, whether the theme is modern or classic, and all themes are basically the same, the locations, the environments bear a fascinating similarity to something we all understand. We may not recognize that we understand, and I hope to clarify that point now, but it is something we all understand. And this theory is what I call "it's all a village." Okay, some possibly unconnected thoughts. When I was a child, and I was a child once, I actually have photographs to prove it, I grew up in a very small town and spent much of my childhood in a very small village nearby. And this was on an island that was just 20 miles wide and 14 miles from top to bottom. Very small island. Small town, even smaller village. And in such an environment, you grow up knowing pretty much everybody. And everyone in the village pretty much knows you. And in such an environment, everybody knows everything about everybody. All the joys and the sorrows, all the scandals, all the celebrations are really part of everyone's awareness. Every village contains the potential, therefore, of fostering all the achievements and all the sins of the world, because every village contains an example of humanity in its great cross-section. Now, in literature, there is a very famous poem on this topic, Gray's Elegy Within a Country Churchyard. Most people know some of them. It's one of the most. Some of the phrases are quoted almost more than Shakespeare. The opening verse: "The curfew tolls the bell of parting day. The lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea. The ploughman homeward plods his weary way and leaves the world to darkness and to me." And in this, he's setting up this environment of small, local, beautiful, simple village. And he talks about the graves in the churchyard and what they all represent, what each of those graves could represent. He goes on later: "The boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth e'er gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. The paths of glory lead but to the grave." So what he is saying is, basically, no matter what you were and what you have done, no matter who you are, you will end up in the grave. And he's also implying that all of those things were present within this graveyard, within this village. Goes on: "Perhaps in this neglected spot is laid some heart once pregnant with celestial fire, a great imagination, a poet perhaps, hands that the rod of empire might have swayed. A possible leader, a possible monarch, a possible president could lie in these graves, or waked to ecstasy the living lyre, a musician, a composer, anything. The wonderful things that the world needs, that the world would benefit from, could have been in this small village and now lie in the grave. Some mute, inglorious Milton may here rest, some great poet who never wrote a line of verse, but could have. Some Cromwell, guiltless of his country's blood. A dictator, or a potential dictator, could lie in this graveyard. But what he is saying, the idea that he is propounding, is that every village contains potential that is often never realized. Potential, nevertheless. Potential that could wreck or rule the world. Potential that could have given us a poet greater than, or playwright greater than Shakespeare, a poet greater than Milton, a composer greater than Bach or Mozart, a leader greater than a Kennedy or an Obama, if you prefer, or whatever your taste is. But we do, even though we don't see it, we recognize it when it's brought to our imagination. When art demonstrates the possibility of such a thing, just as Gray is doing within this poem, we can suddenly recognize the possibility. And that's how plot works. How many of you, for example, if you look back in your own childhood, can look at friends you knew, people that you were at school with, who never, to use the rather hideous phrase, never amounted to anything, but had such potential that was never realized. Villages, I'll go on to explain village in a moment, villages produce enormous potential. And that's how plots work. Another example, Agatha Christie, one of the greatest crime writers ever, actually understood this. She actually got it, and it was why she was such a clever writer. The possibility of pulling absurd and possibly innocuous clues together to build up the proposition of a murder. And she used it in a theme for her greatest lady detective, possibly the greatest lady detective of them all in literature, Miss Marple. Christie understood that all life and all human nature, just as Gray does in his poetry, can be found in a village. So, Miss Marple was created with this remarkable forensic skill in determining the likely course of events in any murder case by likening them to what happens in a village. People are people are people. The man down the street may not be a mass murderer, but if you look carefully at the way he behaves, it may give you indications as to how a mass murderer might think. And we should all do that. Shakespeare grew up in a small market town. Stratford-upon-Avon was a small market town. He, growing up with a father who was both politically motivated and eventually proved to be, shall we say, less than honest, he would have understood the politics, the business behavior, all the other aspects of life from the close perspective of a country town, and a small country town at that. And even, this is where I'm coming closer to the village concept, even a small country town is just a group of villages. Cities, for example, I believe, do not exist, except for matters of efficiency in public services and elections. A city is, in fact, quite simply, a conglomeration of villages. Here in Pittsburgh is the perfect example. You have a city of neighborhoods. Pittsburgh is basically quite renowned to be a city of neighborhoods. The downtown area, as we call it, simply because it's at the bottom of all the hills, the downtown area is really very small. It's got the cultural district and some office buildings, but not much else. Pittsburgh is a city of neighborhoods, each connected, but each with a separate and very clear identity. Where I live in Pittsburgh is very, very different to so many other neighborhoods. And that's true of any city, whether it's a small city like Pittsburgh or as vast as New York or Los Angeles or London or Paris or any other major city in the world. In fact, I'll go slightly further. When we think of a city, we sort of think of an archetype, but there is no such thing as a typical Pittsburgher, or a typical New Yorker, or a Londoner, or Parisian, or even a Dubliner. It all depends on the village you come from within what is called a city. Now, I know both from here in Pittsburgh and from Dublin, which I have some considerable knowledge. To describe a Dubliner, you start off by deciding if they're a North Sider or a South Sider. Then when you've worked that one out, you work which particular district they live in. And when you've worked that out, you work which particular area of streets within that. To find the typical Dubliner or Pittsburgher or New Yorker is an impossibility. You've got to work out the village that the person lives in. And in this sense, the village is not always geographic. It's not just an area easily defined by a few streets or zip code or postal zone. It can be social, it can be economic. People of similar trades or faiths or politics tend to gather together into a social village. Most people, when they tend to describe their town or their city, their description will be very limited to their own social or economic sphere. It is actually quite astonishing how little people know of the greater aspect of the city from which they declare they come and are a proud citizen of. And villages can be similar too. To know the area of your village, the social aspect of your village, as well as the geographical aspect of your village, can change your description and feeling for that village and your behavior within it. I hope you're following all this because it's complex. Shakespeare understood it. As I say, he came from a small town and could probably work out the relationship between people from the relationship that he saw in that small town. And as I say, villages can be more than just geographic. They can be families too. And I don't just mean the nuclear family. I mean the arrangement of a family which is of like-minded or like blood or whatever. Now, Shakespeare wrote one of the most wonderful cycles of plays on the topic of kingship, which we know as the Henriade. And this is an examination of a family at war, the family being the Plantagenets, and the war, which we eventually came to know as the War of the Roses, but it started much earlier and went on much longer than that. Through the cycle of plays of King Richard II, who was usurped by his cousin, who became Henry IV, who was succeeded by his son, Henry V, who was succeeded, having died very young, by his son, who was, I think, a few months old when Henry V died, Henry VI, and therefore a rather weak king. Through the whole period we know as the Wars of the Roses, culminating in the throne being taken by the last of the Plantagenets, King Richard III. Now, Shakespeare wrote this wonderful cycle of plays, which we call the Histories. Now, they are not as historically accurate as one might wish, but that wasn't the point. Shakespeare wasn't writing a history book, he was writing drama. And he was writing drama about this complex family struggle for power. That made it a village. It was within that family grouping of the Yorkists and the Lancastrians, both part of the same Plantagenet line. This was a family war, a village war. And rather similar to a much more modern rendition of a similar topic. In a 3-movie manifestation based on a book, The Godfather is, in a sense, not that different from the Henriade. In a sense, you might say Michael Corleone is the Prince Hal to Vito's Henry IV. Fredo, the long-term family traitor. There are friendly and treacherous dukes and earls, Clemenza and Tessio. There are potential usurpers, Salonzo. God, Italian names. There are would-be kingmakers, Barzini. All of these characters are positively Shakespearean. Why? Because they're coming from that same initial concept. They are a family, a village, fighting within themselves for the retention or the acquisition of power. It's all within the village of their world. I'll come back to that. Arthur Miller wrote what I might call, in fact, several village plays in that sense. We look at A View from the Bridge, being a good example. Story of Eddie Carbone is no more representative of Italian America in general than Puzo's The Godfather. And yet it is representative of so many of us who are victims of the closed villages in which we live. The characters of Catherine and Beatrice in that play are equal victims of this village mentality, this closed set of rules that a village or an accepted behavior, especially when controlled by a somewhat paranoid leading figure, being the father in this case. And the tragedy that will occur in this small village concept, the greater family around them, is pure tragedy. It's a tragedy on Greek proportions in its social context. This is, View from the Bridge is a Greek tragedy in exactly the way as was written 2,500 years earlier. It's working on that same principle. And it teaches us a very vital lesson because we can recognize the events in our own village, in our own experience. Somewhere in our experience, we know an Eddie Carbone. Somewhere in our experience, we know a Prince Hal. somewhere in our experience, we know a Don Vito Corleone. They may not be guiltless, or they may be guiltless of their country's blood, just as the person referred to in Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard. But we know that the potential was there. Each village that we know, be it geographic or social or religious or whatever, each village contains that potential, and we can recognize it. In Edward Albee's Delicate Balance, you can see all in all its glory, the agony of middle-aged, middle-class, middle American life. A family living out their lives in a very clearly defined village, social village, of the home, the neighbors, the friends, the club, all of that. Looking like everybody's American dream of middle-class, middle American life. And yet, within that small village, there is an alcoholic sister, a severely depressed and newly divorced daughter, a couple who are good friends and part of the family until they become an impossible burden emotionally. Now, we may never ourselves witness anything as extreme as the happenings in that particular play, but we can recognize them. We, in our own village, have such people. Indeed, between us and all harm, we may be those people ourselves. What the drama does, by using this concept, by using this principle, that it is a village, we can recognize it if we look. If we have to look, but if we look, we can see it. Let me go back to Arthur Miller. For those who know it, I think we can all recognize the importance of his play, The Crucible. Now, this was a play that was a profound, possibly the most profound artistic comment on the witch hunt for communists in the United States by McCarthy and his House Committee on Un-American Activities. Still love to know what an un-American activity is, but what can you do? But Miller didn't write a play about that. He used a much better format to make his comment about how badly such small village-scale thinking can be, and how much it can cause damage. He wrote a play based very much on history about another witch trial in Massachusetts, 1692-1693. Now, interestingly, the Salem of which Miller wrote was remarkably similar to the small town in Warwickshire in England that Shakespeare grew up in, with very similar people, with very similar prejudices. And the Salem horror happened 80 or so years after Shakespeare's death. So Miller was choosing not only an interesting historic event, but an interesting time frame as well. Because if you look at the kind of behaviorisms and the kind of characters that are there in The Crucible, based on real people, you'll find very similar characters exist in Shakespeare's Elizabethan and Jacobean England. Because The Crucible took place as a result of the prejudices of Elizabethan and Jacobean England. The prejudices that put religious fanatics on boats and sent them across to America. And just as Shakespeare utilizes the principle of village life and village thinking, or family life and family thinking, and I again use that term family in a much broader sense, but the broad family is in itself a village. Miller did that 400 years later with The Crucible. It's not just a play about faith and fear, it is a play also about greed and local prejudice. And I say it's not just a play about faith and fear because those are two very important components to the play. But faith and fear and greed and local prejudice are something that all of us at some point can recognize from our own village, from whatever and however you want to describe that village, as to a place you grew up or a society you grew up within. You can recognize it, and that's why theater works. It's a play about truth against superstition, about corruption of religion to gain profit. And we can still see those things happening today. We can recognize everything that is in the Crucible, just as we can recognize everything that is in Shakespeare, because they are all based on that village concept. Just as in the Henriade of Shakespeare, just as that is a demonstration of a family at war, which brings on the death of many more, so does the war of the broad family we know as the New York Mafia, the Cosa Nostra. It's a village feud which will cause havoc amongst the general population. So these village conflicts affect everybody. But it's not the world at war. Because even in a war, I was listening to a very interesting conversation on public radio yesterday about somebody, a soldier, who was talking about killing. And it reminded me of a couple of other examples of that. And indeed, that wonderful, to my mind, movie, Saving Private Ryan, where you suddenly see war not as some great strategy, but of people doing terrible things because they have to, killing in order to survive. The survival unit, even the small army unit becomes a village in itself. And even within that village, you will have dissenters, you will have loyal, you will have leader, you will have followers. Everything becomes a village. Everything identifies as a village, and that's how we can understand it. We can understand the horror of war, not in the grandiose scale, but in the village scale. It's that simple, statement that one person's death is a tragedy, 100 people's death is a disaster, 3 million people's death is a statistic. We can't understand it in big figures, but we can understand it when it's brought down to that simple village concept. So, as we approach a text, and forgive me, I'm going to be very short today because this is beginning to irritate me. As we approach a text in theatre to examine, well, of course, the first thing you do is read it. And then you want to work out what is the meaning of it. Why are we doing this play? It is not sufficient merely to learn the lines, put on costumes, and say the words. That will not entertain anybody. And that will not do justice or represent the true art of theatre. The true art of theatre is to represent, to show again who we are and what we are and why we do the very strange, wonderful, beautiful, silly, and dangerous things that we do. We, in theatre, in art, represent life to the living, so that the audience, when watching, can not merely see the characters, but can see themselves, and hopefully learn from what they see. Learn to understand themselves more, learn to understand their neighbors more, learn to understand the world better. It sounds very pretentious. It's a very pretentious way of putting it, but it is, in fact, the truth. That is the purpose of all art, to hold, as Shakespeare said, as 'twere, a mirror up to nature, to say, look, this is you. And the best way, indeed, I think the only successful way, and this is where I say, everything I tell you may be wrong, but it's what I believe. The only successful way to do that is to examine every play and every character in that concept that it's only a village. It is a family affair. It is a group of people. And in any small group of people, every potential is within them. As Gray says in his Elegy in a Country Churchyard, here could be a Milton, here could be a Cromwell, here could be an assassin, here could be a saint, here could be a poet. The possibility is always there. And if we understand that when we watch theatre, if we understand that idea, that as we reflect on it, as we reflect on the play we see, and examine our own memories, and the villages, and we all probably live in more than one village, if we examine our knowledge of such a village and ourselves within it, we then begin to see what the value of the play is, that it is in fact showing us ourselves, our friends, our neighbors, people that we can trust, people that we can't trust, people that we shouldn't trust, people that we can love, people that we shouldn't love. All of those things are examined in that way, but through the lens of the village. To see art, we must see it first in its simplest terms, before any of the deeper truths will emerge. You walk into a gallery, an art gallery, and you see, be it a painting by Rembrandt or Van Gogh or any of them, you just see a picture in front of you. But the more you examine it, down to the shapes and the colors and the textures, to the very brushstrokes, the more you examine it, the more you glean from it, the more you understand it. But to understand its depths, you must first accept the picture as an entity, as a thing in itself. How many times you've seen a movie that you really love and you watch it 3, 4, 5 times even? Or a piece of music, the more you watch it, the more you see it. But to see the depth, to see the details, to see the individual natures of the characters within it, you must first see it as an entity, a village. So, fundamentally, I believe that the best way to do this is to begin a play by examining the village in which the play exists, to find all those points of recognition that will make you say, I know that. Yeah, I know somebody just like that. God, no, I'd never let that happen. Any way in which you can look at a play or a movie or a book, I prefer you to look at plays, obviously, and see from that picture things that you recognize from your village. When we find those points of recognition as theatre artists, when we find those for ourselves, because we're going through the same experience as we examine a play, finding our points of recognition. If we do that successfully, that will help, hopefully, the audience to see themselves, to engage their imagination in the way that the book or a novel, for instance, will fire pictures in the mind. You're reading a good book, you're not just reading it, you're seeing it. That's why people always complain when they love a particular book and go and see the movie of the book. It's never right. They never get it right because you have made those pictures yourself from your own imagination. And that's what we attempt to do. We are simply using our imagination in an attempt to fire your imagination with those pictures and those images. And that is why I go back to that point, to see the play or the book in the simplest terms initially. What is that picture it presents to me? And how is that picture composed? Where is the village? Who lives there? And if we can do that, if we can paint pictures through art, whatever the art may be, even music is the same. If we can paint pictures that we recognize, hopefully they will be pictures that you will recognize, because you will know them, you will recognize them from your own personal village. And if you will forgive me, I am going to close the webinar early. We're nearly 20 minutes early, but I'm afraid my eye is irritating the hell out of me. But I will next week, in fact, we are going to be joined again by my associate producer, Sharon McCune. And she is going to be joined by director Robin Walsh. And we are going to be discussing the very first of our Expand the Canon series of plays, which is called An Improbable Fiction, which is thank you, Grace, thank you. I hope my eye feels better later as well. This is a really interesting play on the use of characters from Shakespeare. We'll be doing 2 readings of it on Sunday of next week. And this is, as I say, the first in our cycle of 6 plays for our Expand the Canon series. So next week I have Sharon McCune, who is producing the series, and Robin Walsh, who will be directing this first play. And it's going to be very interesting. And it's one of those few occasions where they allow me to escape and act in a role. So that's going to be fun for me. In the meantime, forgive the shortness of today's talk. I hope it intrigued you. If you have any thoughts, always let me know. I do my best to get back to you, but life is rather busy at the moment, so forgive me if I don't respond. I am interested always in hearing your opinions. In the meantime, do have a nice week. I hope the weather stays as delightful in Pittsburgh as it is, and that wherever you're listening or watching from, I hope the weather is delightful for you too. In the meantime, take care. Bye.